is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
The Two Sessions, China's premier annual political event, has concluded at the Great Hall of the People in Beijing. This year's event has taken place at the most extraordinary of times in history, that is, in the middle of the deadly COVID-19 pandemic. Among the wide range of issues addressed by Chinese leaders is the concerted fight against COVID-19 and epidemic control, as well as the recovery of devastated economies, both at the domestic and international levels. China and Africa's intricate cooperation has also been of special focus, with both sides keen on mapping a prosperous future post-COVID-19. So what does the picture beyond the pandemic look like for China and Africa? And what are the key takeaways that have come out of this year's Two Sessions? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. And to help us explore some of the outcomes from China's recently concluded Two Sessions meeting, I'm joined via Skype from Guangzhou in China by Victor Gao. He's the Deputy Director of the Center for China and Globalization. Victor, thank you for joining us on Talk Africa today.
Thank you.
First off, this year's Two Sessions has taken place under extraordinary circumstances against the background of COVID-19. It was delayed by 2 months, would have taken place in March, now taking place in May. First of all, give us the highlights of the Two Sessions, first domestically and also internationally.
Yes, indeed. This was the first time that the Two Sessions in China were postponed by more than 2 months for the last 40 years. And this was very much caused by the fight against the COVID-19. China was the first victim to fight against this COVID-19. And now China is assisting many countries in the world, including many African countries, in the fight. China is assisting WHO in the global fight against this deadly virus. And I think the messages are very clear. For domestic audience in China, I think these Two Sessions cheered the national population because China made great sacrifices and China won the fight against the COVID-19. And China now need to jumpstart the economy and try to achieve the economic development goal, try to maintain employment, try to boost export, boost production, etc. Internationally, I think the messages were also loud and clear. That is, China was a force for peace. China was against any discriminatory and unfair and unjust so-called investigation into the origin of the virus. China supported WHO in leading the global effort to eventually find out the real origin of the virus. And China appealed to the whole world that right now the top priority should be on continue to fight against the coronavirus and to maintain a steady growth for not only the Chinese economy, but the world's economy as a whole. Therefore, I think China was a voice of reason and sound judgment. And I think China's contribution to global economic development for the rest of the year will be crucial because right now, China is the only country in the world which has more or less contained the COVID-19 virus, at least as far as its domestic market is concerned.
Right.
China now is also dealing with the challenges of imported infections, and this probably will continue for quite a few months to come.
So there were two issues that international audiences were very interested in knowing. One of the key agenda and policy priorities coming out was epidemic control from China, and the other was poverty alleviation. Those were two areas that were in focus. However, no economic targets were set in China for this year as a result of COVID-19. How much disruption has COVID-19 caused for China's economy?
Of course, I think the damage to the Chinese economic growth has been very severe and very profound. I would say that China lost more than 2 months, 2 working months up to now. mainly because China was shut down in a nationwide lockdown for more or less more than 2 months. And lots of factories were closed down, lots of workers were sent back home, lots of people were more or less put under their homes for the fight against the spread of the coronavirus. Now, the restart of the economy is very, very important, and it needs to be handled very properly because you do not want to run the risk of a rebound of the pandemic in China or anywhere else in any parts of the world.
Right.
Therefore, I think the fight against coronavirus needs to be done in a very scientific way, in a very professional way, and the virus is the common enemy of mankind. We should all pitch in on a global basis against the coronavirus. China needs to assist many, many other countries in this joint fight because mankind is vis-a-vis the coronavirus. We are all together on the same side. And the message from China is clear.
So many are wondering, though, Victor, for the rest of the year, for the remainder of the year, what is the expectation from the Chinese economy? Because whatever happens in China will affect the rest of the world. What is the expectation domestically for the Chinese economy?
Well, yes, indeed. I think the Chinese economy, starting from April and more so in May, has been more and more normalized. The very severe lockdown in many parts of China have been gradually lifted. People now can move freely, and many people go back to work, not only in their government positions, teaching positions, but increasingly in manufacturing positions. However, while the rest of the world is still very much under the lockdown, export orders were very much under pressure. I would say by the end of 2020, probably China's annual GDP growth will be half of the original government target of about 6%. So probably we'll be able to achieve 3 or 4% by the end of the year. But that will make China probably the highest growth rate among all the major economies in the world by the end of the year. This is not as good as China's consistent stellar performance over the past 40 years, but it will be one of the best economic performances in the world this year. China is the largest manufacturing country in the world. China is the largest exporter in the world, and China now is the largest consumer market in the world. Therefore, economic development in China is not only important for China itself and the Chinese people themselves, but for the whole world. Therefore, to restore China's robust economic growth is an absolute must for economic recovery of the whole world. Let's hope the coronavirus will soon be put behind us. Mankind will eventually overcome this deadly virus, and we will all recover our economic growth.
Well, hold that thought, Victor, because we want you to listen in to this comment here. Earlier this week, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi spoke of some of the medical initiatives China and Africa will be engaging in the midst and after COVID-19. Let's listen in.
China has subsequently sent medical expert teams to Africa's 5 sub-regions and surrounding countries. Resident Chinese medical teams based in 45 African countries have acted swiftly to assist in the local response. They have held nearly 400 training sessions for tens of thousands of African medical workers. This year marks the 20th anniversary of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation. China's relations with Africa have stood the test of time and continue to flourish. We will continue to stand by Africa as it fights the virus. We will send anti-epidemic assistance to African and other developing countries as a matter of priority. We are considering sending more medical expert teams to the continent. China will continue to deliver on the health initiative announced at the FOCAC Beijing summit. We will accelerate construction of the headquarters for the Africa CDC and help boost public health capacity in African nations.
Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi there. Victor Gao, I want to come to a few issues on what the two sessions had as an implication for China-Africa relations and for Africa as a whole, because Foreign Minister Wang Yi talked about China and Africa's history of medical cooperation. He outlined some of the initiatives in health cooperation that moving forward during the COVID-19 in Africa and post-COVID-19 that China will continue supporting Africa. Are there any indicators on how and when some of these initiatives will be implemented? For instance, the formation of the support of Africa's CDC.
Absolutely. I think China has a very strong tradition of working very closely with African brothers and sisters throughout the continent of Africa in development, in capacity building, in nation building, and also in healthcare sector. We know that in the 1960s, for example, China worked with African countries in terms of what we call barefoot doctors, mostly working in rural areas in Africa. And now China probably has the largest number of doctors and nurses, medical experts throughout different parts of Africa. And I think one lesson we have all learned from this COVID-19 is that we all need to be prepared against another outbreak of virus. And pandemic or epidemic will be always with mankind, and we cannot let our guard down. Therefore, China's commitment to help Africa as a whole, to set up the African CDC and to work very closely with African CDC, with WHO, etc., will be absolutely important for the sustained health and public safety and security of the African brothers and sisters.
All right. So, Victor, before I let you go, I want to get your thoughts on one point that you touched on, because you talked about restoring China's growth as an absolute must for the world and for world economic growth. I want to get a feel of you from the diplomatic front, though. Many are watching China's response to the external, environment and how the country will handle its foreign policy. Will China adapt to the new normal now post-COVID-19? What will China's foreign policy look like moving forward?
I would say several things will be very important. One is that China will always stick to the policy of treating everyone else as an equal. Big or small countries, strong or weak countries, African, Latin American, European, developed countries, etc. China always view each country as an equal. China never puts itself above anyone else. And any head of state or head of government or government delegations from any country coming from Africa will be treated equally as another country from a more developed part of the world. This is very important. Equality and sharing experiences with other countries. And also, China will not seek hegemony, and China will not be a rocker of the boat, for example. China does not have any intention to replace any other superpower in the world. And I believe China always believes in win-win situation. If you believe that you can make all the money at the expense of anyone else, any other country, any other continent, your proposition will not be long sustainable. It's always mutual benefit and win-win situation, which will be long-lasting. It will generate more benefits for everyone involved. This will remain China's strategy. And between China and Africa, between China and the African countries, between the Chinese people and African countries, allow me to emphasize solidarity, brotherhood, sisterhood, equal treatment, and recognizing each other as an equal, learn from each other, will continue to be the most important common unifying factor between us. And China-African friendship will be long-lasting.
All right, Victor Gao, thank you very much joining us there from Guangzhou via Skype. Well, thank you for your insights. He's the Deputy Director of the Center for China and Globalization, and also a current affairs and political commentator. Well, we are now going to take a short break, and when we come back, we'll cross over to Africa to look into some of the continent's observations of this year's two sessions meeting in China. We'll be right back.
Life moves pretty fast. Ideas move at the speed of sound. Technology moves at the speed of light. If you don't filter out the noise, you might miss the details. We pay attention to the details because they matter, showing you a different perspective. See the difference.
China will continue to work with Africa on development capacity building. We will work out ways to move ahead with major ongoing cooperation projects and support African countries in reopening businesses soon to sustain Africa's economic momentum. We will work with other G20 members to implement the debt service suspension initiative to ease Africa's debt burden. We're also considering further bilateral support for African countries under the greatest strain to help our African brothers and sisters through this difficult time.
And that was State Councillor and Foreign Minister Wang Yi pointing out some of the economic measures China will be taking to revive economic activity between China and Africa in the wake of COVID-19. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now, I'm joined via Skype by Michael Tudekasa. He's in Johannesburg and he's the CEO of the Africa Business Group. Michael, welcome to this discussion and thank you for joining us on Talk Africa. Well, let's start off by looking at the two sessions this year because it has taken place amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. What are international observers like yourself looking out for more specifically regarding what is of interest to Africa?
Well, definitely the world is turned upside down now. So most of the governments on the continent are looking for financial support or financial relief where there are loans outstanding. And as China is a major lender to the continent, that support both as a debtor, if you will, for the continent. There's a desire to have loan forgiveness, but also China has been a major investor and contributor to the continent. And so the idea would be that they would find a way to continue to support their partners on the continent. But it's a very delicate time. And so I think many countries are still trying to analyze what's going to happen with major partners.
You talk about this, the financial support, and Foreign Minister Wang Yi, of course, did mention that China is working with other G20 members to implement the debt service suspension initiatives in a bid to ease Africa's burdens, particularly during this time of COVID-19. What are some of the viable propositions, though, both from China and from Africa that can address that debt situation? Is debt relief as impactful as we are made to think?
Well, the thing is this, I mean, for the last 2 plus almost 3 months, there's been very little commercial activity globally, which means that all of the countries of the continent are really at risk. Many have already received funds from the IMF or are looking for funds from the IMF. And so definitely from the G8 and individual countries that are major debtors to the continent, there's a desire for relief. And the challenge is that the income that African nations typically get from exporting, particularly mineral resources, is just not there. The bottom has fallen out of the world petroleum market, and that doesn't look like it will come back soon given the travel challenges that we have. So debt relief is one lever, if you will, that will help the continent and the countries of the continent.
Well, as the continent tries to recover economically, though, of course, China and Africa have been large trade partners. China has been Africa's largest trade partner since 2009, and it is Africa's largest investment partner now. Experts are saying that it may take years for sectors to recover. Which sectors are you looking at? Which sectors are going to restart economies post-COVID-19?
Well, it's an interesting thing. One of the potential upsides of COVID-19 will be increased intra-African trade. Global supply chains have taken a major hit on the continent. And so the idea that countries like South Africa, countries like Nigeria, countries like Kenya will play a bigger role in supplying their neighbors and perhaps even trading with one another is something that the Continental Free Trade Area foresaw, but I'm sure not as fast as is happening. Definitely all things digital are going to grow in the very near future. So there's new discussions about blockchain and the utilization of e-commerce platforms to facilitate trade on the continent. I think that tourism can grow, but it will be domestic and regional tourism that grows. Long-haul tourism may take quite a while to recover. The continent still has to feed itself. In the next few years, we'll have a population of 2 billion people, and food security is still going to be a challenge. So I think that that's one of the critical areas that will continue to grow.
Right, so let's look at one other key factor that came out of the two sessions, epidemic control. Of course, as a result of the current pandemic, was a key focus of the two sessions. From your perspective, and looking at this as an observer, and looking at the assistance that China has provided Africa during the COVID-19 situation, what are the likely lessons of COVID-19 in China-Africa relations now and going into the future?
Well, definitely it has not been lost on leaders on the continent, in the public sector and the private sector, that the African healthcare system is very fragile, and that economic development without significant improvement in the healthcare system is not likely to happen. Africa has, to a large extent, dodged a bullet because if there was a need for the hospital beds, for the equipment, for the PPE, the continent would be found wanting in terms of having had those supplies or that equipment on hand. So one of the areas of cooperation toward the future can be China playing a greater role in supporting the healthcare sector more broadly. There's a new African Union Center for Disease Control that needs support, and there are many countries around the continent that China has helped, and China going forward, and African nations engaging China going forward, should look to put healthcare support on the table of those negotiations.
So do you think, though, that COVID-19 and its impact may call for a reset of China-Africa relations going forward, particularly as China, and Africa mark 20 years of focus? And if so, what areas of focus do you think that China and Africa should be looking at now following COVID-19?
Well, there's a couple. One of them is the whole area of Africa becoming more of a manufacturing platform for the world, definitely for its own member states. But as China continues to grow, and as GDP grows, and as GDP per capita grows, it is soon to be no longer the least cost destination to manufacture goods. And the continent, though, with a very young population, a growing population, presents both a market and a potential platform for manufacture for itself and for the continent. I mean, for the world in that regard. So partnerships where Chinese technology, Chinese manufacturing expertise can be transferred to the continent should be at the forefront from an African standpoint of those discussions. I think one of the things that I should add, and this is, again, it's an uglier part of the COVID-19, which was some discrimination of Africans in China. I think the national government quickly sought to squash that and address that. But I think that has to be, it reared its head in the middle of this pandemic and got a lot of circulation on the WhatsApps and the news. And so strengthened people-to-people understanding should be a part of the new engagement, if you will, post-COVID between China and Africa. But there's still a lot of I think, goodwill. There's still demand on the continent for the market that China represents. And so I think that there'll be a desire to export to China. And as I said, technology transfer from China and investment from China will still be sorely needed post-COVID-19.
So, Michael, the holding of the two sessions at this point perhaps signals that there is an injection of impetus now for economic recovery in China. From Africa's perception, though, what is Africa's expectation of China moving forward as the pandemic is brought under control and as economies reopen?
I think this is a conversation that is ongoing. And why am I saying ongoing? The world may be rebalancing, but there's definitely shocks that are happening across it. And Africa has historic strong relations with Europe, more recent relations with the United States, and of course its long-standing relationships with China. All three of those, I won't say they're in flux, but there's a bit of what is going to happen. There's an election season in the United States. There's been hard hit impact in Europe with Italy, with Spain, with the UK, all of whom are strong, particularly Italy and the UK, partners with the continent. There's Brexit, what happens post-Brexit. So I would argue that we're right in the middle of trying to grapple with all of those things. Again, I mentioned that many countries are seeking support from the IMF. And so I don't know that most countries right now, here in May, have calculated what the new universe will look like with China or with anyone else. I think that give it 3-4 months, 5 months, end of the year, when some of the shock and the triage that is right now has been dealt with. And then I think the AU, for example, it'll be very interesting to see what the next AU meeting is like and what topics are on the table. I think there you can get some inkling of which direction the countries and the continent will go with in terms of its partnerships. I think in the meantime, the support from a healthcare standpoint that has come from China is appreciated, come from Cuba, other parts of the world is definitely appreciated. And I think that's where we are. We're still a bit in crisis mode and trying to keep the communities safe and trying to open up at the same time, although we didn't close as hard. But when the rest of your partners are closed, it's hard to be open. So now that some of them are starting to open up, there's the effort to re-engage. So I think ideally that this could be part of an ongoing conversation, and in 3 months or so, one can have a better feel for what real impact COVID-19 will have on the relationships between the continent and Africa.
All right, Michael Sudekas, a very insightful session indeed. Thank you very much for your thoughts on Talk Africa today. Well, that's all we have time for this week on the program. Thank you to our guests for their insights. Victor Gao earlier in the program from Gwangju and Michael Sudekas in Johannesburg, both joining us via Skype. Remember to follow the conversation online through our social media handles displaying currently on your screens right now. And be sure to catch us again next week on Talk Africa. For me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team in Nairobi, it's goodbye.